Hello, welcome everyone to today's event. My name is Erika Lee. I teach history and Asian American studies at the University of Minnesota, and I also direct the Immigration History Research Center. And I'm so excited for our first event of the school year with Adam Goodman and Jimmy Patiño. But before we get started, I wanted to highlight a few housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded. The question and answer portion will happen via the Q&A function down below of your Zoom screen. You can submit a question at any time during the presentation. You don't have to wait until the Q&A section of the program later in this hour. You can do it at any time. We will look at those audience questions in the last 20 minutes or so, but again, you can choose to submit a question anonymously at any time if you don't want your name to be mentioned when the question is posted. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today. We are welcoming Adam Goodman, who teaches in the Department of History and Latin American and Latino Studies at the University of Illinois, Chicago. He's the author of the award-winning book, The Deportation Machine, America's Long History of Expelling Immigrants, which was published by Princeton University Press in 2020, and it's now out in paperback just this past month. It was a finalist for the Los Angeles Times Book Prize in History, and it was the winner of multiple awards, including the PROSE Award in North American History from the Association of American Publishers. Adam has discussed his research on many venues, including NPR and the BBC Radio. His writing has appeared in many journals and newspapers, including the Washington Post, The Nation, and the Journal of American History. He's also a co-creator of the Immigration Syllabus, which was created in 2017 by the Immigration History Research Center and by immigration historians and scholars from across the country. He's also co-organizer of the Borderlands and the Latino Studies Seminar at the Newberry Library in Chicago, and is a member of the Statue of Liberty Ellis Island Foundation's History Advisory Committee. So thank you so much, Adam, for joining us. We're so excited that you're here.
Thank you, Erica. I really appreciate it. I'm grateful for the opportunity to discuss my work with everyone. And I just want to thank you and Margie Tang Oxley and Jimmy Patiño and everyone involved in organizing today's event. And thanks to everyone for joining us during the middle of a workday and a busy week, I'm sure, for many of you. Before I kind of jump in and give people a broader overview of the book and some of its major interventions, if you haven't had a chance to look at it yet, I wanted to share just a little bit of information about how I came to this project. And I'm really looking forward to engaging in a broader discussion with Jimmy and Erica and the rest of the attendees. But the origins of this project did not date back to the previous presidential administration. In fact, this is something I started working on in 2008, 2009. And I came across a startling statistic, which really caught my attention and made me curious to learn more. And that was that the United States has deported nearly 57 million people since the 1880s. That's more than any other country in the world. And during the last century, US officials have expelled more people than they've allowed to remain in the country on a permanent basis. And that surprised me, to be quite honest, and I wanted to learn more. But there were a couple of other influences as well that kind of shaped the making of this book. One was the time that I spent living in the US-Mexico borderlands in South Texas in the lower Rio Grande Valley. And it was there that I really saw the ways that immigration policies affected people's lives on a day-to-day basis. I was teaching high school. Many of my students themselves were migrants, were from immigrant families. Some of them crossed on a regular basis, in fact, during the school year. And before I started graduate school, it was that formative experience that really, I think, made me curious to learn more about the histories of immigration policies and also how people had navigated them. And in 2008, 2009, for those of you that remember, these were the first years of the Obama administration, and a lot of attention was all of a sudden on the administration for the record numbers of formal deportations from the country. And that didn't necessarily square with what many people saw as Obama's politics of hope. And I was curious to learn more about that. How could that be that the Obama administration was deporting hundreds of thousands of people through these formal expulsions each year? But also, I was really curious and really inspired, I think, by young people across the country who came out as undocumented, unafraid, and unapologetic, and started organizing and pushing back and trying to navigate what they saw as punitive and inhumane policies that affected them and their families and their broader communities. So these dual interests emerge in tracing the histories of immigration policy and deportation, how it had changed over time, as well as how people had fought back against what I would come to think of as the deportation machine. So it was kind of, in that context, this project emerged, and never did I think that it would take on perhaps even, greater public relevance when the 2016 election occurred. And, Donald Trump took office the following year. And immigration, of course, was on the front pages of the papers for the vast majority of his presidency. But one of the things that I wanted to do was historicize deportation and to help us better understand the longer century-and-a-half long history, in fact, of the deportation machine. So I want to share my screen with everyone and just hopefully give a broad sense of some of the key interventions I'm making, some of the key points the book makes, and some of the things that I'd like to think about today with all of you. This photograph is from the 1950s. From the middle of the 1950s, this is a family of Mexican migrant farm workers who were rapidly deported from South Texas, and they were in northern Mexico here, embarking on a 400-mile or so trek back to their home in San Luis Potosí. And this photo is striking, obviously, when I came across it at the National Archives, and it speaks to a number of the themes that I address in the book as well. First and foremost, that deportation affects many people, not just single male laborers, as oftentimes the stereotype might be that those are the primary people targeted for expulsion. But there are many people, whether they themselves are expelled or whether they are affected by someone else's expulsion or the targeting by immigration officials. That was something I really wanted to, wrestle with. And the human cost of deportation is something I'll return to in a minute. But something else I wanted to highlight was the long bipartisan history. Right? So my book starts again in the 1880s and goes up until 2020, the recent past. And this photograph is of the aftermath of an immigration raid in the late 1970s. So the first photograph in the 1950s during the Eisenhower administration, this photograph in the 1970s, late 1970s during Jimmy Carter's administration, in which the deportation machine was affecting millions of people each year. And what I try to do in this project is to show how Democrats and Republicans alike, and also many business interests, as well as bureaucratic interests, have mobilized expulsion policies for their own ends, including the current administration, the Biden administration. And I think my book offers some insights as to why deportations continue today under the Biden administration, which I'd be happy to talk about as well. But it's a combination of bureaucratic, capitalist, and racist imperatives that have propelled the machine during the last century and a half. And that was something I really wanted people to better understand. Many historians and people who have read deeply in history, students of history, may have known some of that. But I think most people in the general public, through the conversations I've had since the book has come out, are fairly unaware of that longer, deeper history, moving beyond the Trump administration. So the first point I wanted to share with everyone is that this is a long bipartisan story. The second point is that a deportation without due process has long been the American way. And what I do in my book is I break down the machine into three primary mechanisms of expulsion, as you see here at the top: formal deportations, voluntary departures, which, as we'll discuss, are not voluntary at all, and then the so-called self-deportations. And I'll just briefly describe each so we have a sense of what I mean by each of these terms. Formal deportations are what people are most familiar with. It's what the news media reports on the most. typically, historically, at least, have been by order of an immigration judge. There's some kind of due process or legal process involved, although that's changed recently. We know very little about the next two mechanisms, voluntary departures and self-deportation, which is what I spend much of the book discussing and exposing. And I think this is where we really need to better understand how the deportation machine has worked. Now, voluntary departures, despite their name, are mandatory. They're essentially administrative expulsions that happened when low-level agents of the state, so Border Patrol officers, ICE agents, and other officials within the immigration bureaucracy can determine whether or not someone is allowed to stay or whether they need to go. These happen through expedited means. There is no due process in most of these cases. And this, in fact, makes up about 48 million of the 57 million deportations during the last 140 or so years. As you can see in this chart here on the screen, if we don't take voluntary departures seriously, then we're really missing a big piece of the story of the history of deportation, the size and scope, the chronology, the role that it's played in US politics, and how it's really affected migrants, and in particular, as I'll discuss, Mexicans. So voluntary departures, you might think of similar to the role that plea bargains play in the criminal justice system. The system wouldn't work without them, but it's essentially the best of all the bad options facing someone. And officials kind of weaponize that and use that strategically in order to push people out of the country through fast-track mechanisms and also at great cost savings to the bureaucracy. In fact, the deportation machine wouldn't have been able to have detained, held hearings, as well as processed all of the paperwork for all of the people apprehended over the last century and a half. So voluntary departures are essential to the deportation machine's functioning, as are self-deportations. And self-deportations, these are essentially when someone has not had any contact with an immigration official, unlike voluntary departures and formal deportations, which occur after someone's apprehended. Self-deportation is essentially the policy of making people's lives so miserable that they decide to pick up and leave on their own. And what I try to argue in the book is that we need to recognize this is a key mechanism of expulsion that is purposeful, that local, state, and federal officials and governments have strategically put in place in hopes of doing some of that dirty work for them. And self-deportations have happened in response to fear campaigns, widespread fear campaigns. They've happened in response to immigration raids, to fear spread throughout the media, as well as violence and the threat of violence. Right? The threat of expulsion oftentimes might cause someone to leave. Now, most people have not responded to these campaigns by picking up and leaving, but some have, and we should recognize the role that fear has played. And we certainly saw in the previous presidential administration that was a key thing that they ramped up. So these three mechanisms have been at play since the federal immigration bureaucracy took over deportations in the late 19th century in 1891. And they've kind of worked in tandem, sometimes one mechanism rising over the other. And one thing you'll see in this graph, perhaps, is that in recent years, really, in the last 25 years or so, since 1996, the number of formal deportations have dramatically increased as a result of changes in immigration law, in part because there's just been such an explosion of funding for immigration enforcement after September 11th, 2001, as national security interests and migration policies were intertwined, ever more so. But one of the interesting things we see and that I show in the book is that formal deportations, despite the fact that they carry harsher penalties and more consequences, negative consequences for migrants, they've come to resemble voluntary departures in their streamlined nature. So today, around 3/4 of all formal deportations happen through streamlined measures, where people don't really have their day in court, so to speak. The US laws have made it very difficult for people to fight for the right to stay. So deportation without due process has long been the American way. The third thing that I discovered as I dug deeper into the research was that there's been a disproportionate targeting of Mexicans. And I think this has had real consequences. I don't have enough time to go into great detail here, but a good portion of the middle of the book focuses on the campaigns to expel Mexicans from the country while also welcoming people in on a temporary basis to supply the labor needed. And I think that, the targeting of Mexicans, disproportionate targeting of Mexicans, who make up around 9 out of every 10 deportees throughout the last century or so, has had a really detrimental effect on broader understandings, whether it's among the public or the media or politicians, of the broader question of, what does it mean to be an American? And Mexicans, and the creation of the idea and the stereotype of Mexicans as the prototypical illegal aliens, quote unquote, is something that in large part has to do with the targeting of immigration officials and helping create that very idea, right? So that was an effect rather than a cause in that sense. But here on the left, you see some newspaper headlines from the 1930s of the Great Depression, the repatriation and deportation campaigns of the 1930s, both announcing upcoming raids on Mexican community, but also reporting on deportation drives that had already taken place. And this was part of this broader campaign to spread fear, and on the other hand, to inform the community. But media headlines that were splashy and sensational like this couldn't help but spread fear as well. The photograph on the right, fast forward 50 or so years, half a century, and you have in the 1970s and 80s, what I refer to as the dawn of the age of mass expulsion. It's really at this point in time when deportation or the possibility of an encounter with an immigration official becomes an everyday occurrence for many people living in migrant communities and many ethnic Mexicans as well, including Mexican Americans and permanent residents. So this protest, which I feel like could almost be a photo from more recent years. You see the boy in the front there holding a sign that says, "Reagan, no me separes de mis padres." Reagan, don't separate me from my parents, in response to US officials wrongfully deporting a 14-year-old legal resident from California, from the greater LA area. And this was not an uncommon occurrence, and in part I think had to do with the fact that Mexicans had been disproportionately targeted. And that's something that we should really recognize and take into account historically, and something that I think my book shows in no uncertain terms. Another thing that I focus on in the book are the human costs of deportation, and the fact that we need to understand the intersection of profit motive as well as kind of the motive to punish as being integral to the formation of immigration policies in the 20th century. So part of the book traces the different vehicles and transportation networks, privately owned and publicly funded transportation networks that were used to physically remove people from the country. If we actually think about how is someone removed from the country, that opens up a whole range of questions. And one of the things I found in the archive was that US officials relied on a combination of public and private transportation, from buses and planes to boats and trains. And oftentimes, companies were in this business to make a buck off of human misery, off of the suffering of migrants. And it wasn't just US companies. One of the things that I found was that Mexican companies were involved, other companies from the Americas, once they heard the US was in the business of deporting people, started offering their services as well. So the profit motive was key here, but so was punishment. And I'll speak to that in just a second. But this photograph is of a group of deportees about to board a Flying Tiger airplane, a charter plane, which was the largest contract company that the INS, the Immigration Service, used in the 1950s. They later went on to become, I think, one of the largest private carriers in the country before they were bought out by FedEx in the 1980s. But they flew tens of thousands of Mexicans from the United States, mostly from South Texas, deep into the Mexican interior as part of these larger campaigns. But most of this chapter, in which I examine these transportation networks and the punishment and profit motives, examines what was known as the boat lift, which transported nearly 50,000 Mexicans in the middle of the 1950s from Port Isabel, Texas, in the Rio Grande Valley, down to Veracruz across the Gulf of Mexico. And this was an operation that the US and Mexican governments collaborated on. Both US and Mexican government officials held extraordinarily, kind of notably, racist views of Mexican migrants, which in turn justified the treatment. But the companies themselves were looking to make a profit, and that meant minimizing costs, providing bare bones conditions. As you can see in this photo here of one of the holds of the ships, which were used by these companies to take bananas from like the Mexican state of Tabasco up to places in the US South like Alabama. And then on the return trip home, seeking to take advantage of the cargo space, the private transportation companies, which were Mexican companies again, fit as many deportees as they could, between 500 and 800, depending on the ship and depending on the company. But this was something that had the bonus effect for the INS, for the US officials, of punishing migrants, right? The bare bones conditions, the extraordinarily difficult trip across the Gulf, which could take up to 2 days. This was meant as a deterrence mechanism, right? We've heard of, or we've thought of, the idea of prevention through deterrence in recent years, whether it's the separation of Central American asylum-seeking children and parents during the previous administration, or in the 1990s, the buildup of border infrastructure and the militarization of the border between the United States and Mexico in hopes of pushing migrants into more desolate and dangerous, ultimately deadly areas as a way of discouraging migration. This was similar, right? The trip was meant to be horrible and meant to want to make people stay in Mexico. We know that in none of those cases, you have prevention through deterrence mechanisms actually stop people from migrating. But the human costs have been extraordinary. And this was planned. I really want to make this explicit. This was a part of the system, despite the US officials saying this was a humanitarian measure of some sort to bring people closer into the where they lived in Mexico. This was part of the system. And this is something that, in no uncertain terms, the INS Commissioner Joseph Swing, who was an old Army buddy of President Eisenhower, said, we hope, right? We hope that this is effective punishment mechanism, means of deterrence. So this is something to keep in mind, this connection between state policies creating a profitable market in human suffering. And this isn't something that just of the recent past, this is something that has a much longer history. And the last point I wanted to highlight is that one of the reasons I wrote the book was to better understand the deportation machine. So I think in order to fight against it, or to fight against inhumane policies, to push for more just immigration policy, we first need to understand how the machine works. And that's something, as I got deeper into the archives and the oral histories and interviews that I did, that I learned from people. They were keenly aware of these mechanisms and where the pressure points were. And then once they identified them, the most effective ways of fighting back, they would apply as much pressure as they could. And that usually happened through migrant-led solidarity and mass organizing, right? Sustained over long periods of time. And this photograph here in the late 1970s of Jose Jacques Medina speaking to a group of a couple of hundred people gathered in Los Angeles. Again, could be aside from the black and white photo as the giveaway, it could be from the more recent past as well, right? Basta con la migra. And they're fighting against policies, again, which have a longer history, but a fair amount of continuity. And we've seen in more recent years that it's oftentimes been the youth themselves, including many students here at the University of Illinois Chicago, some of whom you see here marching in this photo, who came out as undocumented and unafraid, and who started some of the coming out of the shadows events in 2009, 2010, which have since proliferated across the country. But people have been trying to identify the weak points of the machine and fighting back and fighting not only for themselves, but for their broader communities. And that's something that I was interested in tracing throughout this book as well. And I think ultimately, the key, despite whatever small victories, is that we need really an entirely new system. If there's one thing we learned from the book, it's that we need to minimize the number of people that come into contact with the deportation machine, because little piecemeal reforms aren't the real solution. Although at the same time, people in the here and now who need aid, who need assistance, who need relief and need support, we can't deny or neglect those real needs while also pushing for much broader reforms to the system. So I just wanted to close on that note, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion. I have contact information here, and if you are interested in a hard copy of the book, the publisher has generously offered a discount, which you can see there on the screen. But thank you all for joining us again, and I'm going to turn it over to Professor Patiño now, I think, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Adam. I know it was really hard to summarize the book in 20 minutes. You did a fabulous job, and we'll have lots of opportunity to dig a little bit deeper into some of the questions and the themes and the issues that you raised. So just a quick reminder, anybody can start to submit a question if they want right now in the Q&A function. But also I'm really pleased to welcome to the Zoom room Professor Jimmy Patiño, an associate professor of Chicano Latino Studies here at the University of Minnesota. He's also a longtime member of the IHRC and IHRC Archives Advisory Council. His first book, another fantastic book, Raza Si Migra No, Chicano Movement Struggles for Immigrant Rights in San Diego, was the first full-length study to solely focus on the Chicano movement of the 1960s and 1970s and its relationship to immigration. He's now working on a number of other projects, including a study that investigates the conceptualization and historical practice of solidarity, primarily through the lens of African-American, Chicanx, and Puerto Rican sites of struggle in the 20th century. So welcome, Jimmy. Thank you so much for helping to moderate this discussion.
Thanks so much, Erika. And thank you for your help and all the staff at the IHRC for creating this, this space for us to have this crucial dialogue. And thank you for participating, Adam, and sharing your fantastic work. You know, the one key kind of contribution I see is right in the title, right? I mean, conceptualizing of immigration policies beyond a set of policies, but much rather a machine that serves a number of elitist interests, I think is a project that you know, I see you as a comrade in doing. So I congratulate you on that. One of my mentors, Daniel Widener, cultural historian of Black radicalism, one time noted that a brilliant intervention is one that seems obvious, but hasn't been unearthed or articulated yet. And your focus on voluntary departures as not only one kind of way in which the machine functioned, but much rather something where we really unearth how it works and how a deliberate avoidance of due process was implemented and kind of changed form through time, of course, but really relied on that category's functioning. So that was really illuminating to me, and especially to my students. Not to mention the way the categories you frame, really give structure and understanding to the way the system works for the students, which is the primary way we've been talking about it for the past 2 to 3 weeks as we've read it. So my first question kind of relates to that. My class has the determination that this system is inherently violent, right? And in need of major reform, if not abolition, right? But I think one thing your book shows is the flexibility of this regime. And so the question I want to ask is, why is it important that we reveal the flexibility and the change through time that this regime has gone through? How does that help us fight it more in a better way?
Yeah, thank you so much. And thanks you know, to your class for engaging with the book and its ideas. I'm looking forward to the questions as well. I only wish we could all be in person, but you know, I think that it's really important to identify the way the machine has operated and the way it's changed, and also what hasn't changed. You know, there's a fair amount of continuity in the book in terms of the mechanisms themselves, what the mechanisms are, and I think of a fair amount of continuity as well in terms of a limited number of motivating factors behind, you know, what drives the machine or propels it, but it changes at different moments at different times, and we should pinpoint that. And as I said, that's what activists have done. It's not as if, you know, if someone today or someone 10 or 20, 50, 100 years ago, you know, asked how to go about what's the most effective way of fighting back against the deportation machine, the answer wouldn't necessarily be the same. So we need to recognize that it's kind of a give and take. And also as activists, strategize and organize the community to fight back and push back, the immigration officials oftentimes themselves are reacting in turn to figure out what's the best way to maintain the machine's smooth functioning. And I don't want to give off the idea that things were always kind of running smoothly. And a lot of times this is a very disjointed process. People's activism is oftentimes successful. But what we see, and speaks to your point that you brought up at the beginning as well, is that regardless of who's in power, and who's in power, we certainly know after the Trump administration, it matters a great deal. Like, it really does matter who's in power. But the immigration bureaucracy itself, it has its own agenda. And as long as it is enforcement first and service like a really distant second, I think a lot of the problems we see are going to remain. And that's something that we've seen play out in the first year here, I think, of the Biden administration. Regardless of whatever the rhetoric might be, we see so many of the policies have remained the same. So tracing and tracking how they've changed over time, what are the different possibilities, and also what are the strategies that have worked in the past, I think can be really instructive and useful.
Great, thanks so much. No, and that really brings up and begins to hit on another kind of preoccupation the class has had around, looking at Republican versus Democratic leadership and noting what is overlapping and how they share, share the responsibility for creating and maintaining the machine, and then what the differences are. So that's helpful in helping us think that through.
Yeah. Could I just jump in real quick?
Sure, please.
The last 4 years are so interesting because as immigration politics got more polarized, like we started to see some opening between the two parties that maybe didn't exist in the past, whereas the two parties' policies in many ways were very similar, or more similar than not, perhaps. During the Trump administration, things became more polarized, and I think that created opportunities. I mean, I think the Democrats have an opportunity to this day, really, to break from those past policies, but that would take a certain amount of acknowledgement of their involvement in creating them, and assuming responsibility and really wanting to make a clean break and go in a much different direction. Whether kind of the political stars align for that, or whether someone's going to make it the important issue that it is and should be, is another question. But in some way, I feel like the polarization could be helpful.
Absolutely, I agree 100%. And I think the other question I want to ask is related to, I think another point of opportunity and maybe some shift in terms of some polarization around the way the two parties have addressed immigration is related, of course, to social movements, and to kind of bottom up organizing from migrants themselves and their allies and whatnot. So one thing we also navigated was how you were able to use kind of formal archival sources, right, to, of course, study the anatomy of the machine, but how you match that with archival sources of social movements, but especially the oral histories, how you're able to engage migrants themselves who fought against or survived, experienced the worst effects of the regime. So especially all those oral histories, what kind of collective ideas or response to the regime did you get from that, being able to engage those folks?
This is such a key question, and we need so much more of this work and so many more of the sources. And really, just really quick side note, but I would plug your book again and the work that you've done in creating some of those sources. And it's an incredible resource, and kind of the oral histories that you do with Herman Baca, and the digitized archive of the Baca papers at UC San Diego. And these are the types of sources that we need to better understand these histories. Because when I started on this book, kind of a senior scholar in the field whose work I really admire, and who I really admire, personally as well, it told me, you're probably not going to be able to do this project. Because kind of after the 1950s, the sources dry up in the National Archives, and I just don't know how you'll piece it together. And that kind of set me back for a bit. I was kind of sitting in a tailspin there, questioning my own, ability and faith in myself as to whether I could figure it out. And part of it was just kind of chipping away at, each piece, little by little, each chapter has its own set of source bases, some of them the same, some of them very different, but especially the more recent histories, the post-1965 histories, once the National Archives sources are no longer available, and when really immigration activism, I think, starts in earnest in a way that we can recognize today. It's that moment of the 70s that you talk about in your book and that I'm interested in as well, this moment of the kind of dawn of the age of mass expulsion, where people are organizing and fighting back, building off the Chicano movement, building off the civil rights movement. And many of the people that I found and interviewed and spoke to, were very much aware of those longer struggles and the solidarity that was key to that. And a lot of the lawyers and labor activists and organizers that I spoke with, they told me that they got their start in the civil rights movement, the Chicano movement, as young people, in their 20s, right out of college or right out of law school at that time. And, that was something that they took forward as immigration became, a much more important issue. But one thing I did know was that I didn't know very much at all, in part because a lot of the sources weren't there. Sociologists had studied this, anthropologists had studied this. I mean, your book wasn't out at that time, when I was first working on this. But I knew that I needed to go to the community and try to better understand from their perspective, as opposed to whatever the government record said, understand from the community's perspective. And that could be through legal records, organizational records of, activist groups, but also just speaking with people and listening, more than speaking, actually listening, asking questions and taking directive from them as to what were the things that were important to them. And I think, through that listening and kind of casting a wide net, doing oral histories here in Chicago, in Texas, in Los Angeles, and California, also in Mexico. I spent 3 years living in Mexico while working on this book. And I think that was really important to see things from the other side of the border as well, to better understand, as I mentioned in the beginning with that photograph, the many people affected by deportation and migration, for that matter. I interviewed people that had never migrated themselves, but their 7 siblings lived in the United States, and their lives were very much affected by immigration. Many of their family members had been deported, apprehended on multiple occasions, and that that reached well into Mexico for people who hadn't migrated, which is very eye-opening to me as well. And I would have known had I not, I think, cast a wide net. So for me, it was trying to cast a wide net as possible, as historians, I think, are trained to do and we should do, and try to make sense of the information that we gather. But we shouldn't give ourselves kind of a selective, starting point by only going to government archives or only going to, sources that others have used.
Hey, I'm going to jump in here and kind of ask a follow-up question on sources and archives. As you know, the IHRC and the IHRCA have been formed in the 1960s as an archival institution, as the Immigrant Archives. And so sources, of course, we're all historians, so we can nerd out on the kinds of sources that we've all relied upon. But all of us have also faced huge obstacles, institutional obstacles, historical obstacles in getting access to sources that we don't even know exist, right, when we first start to begin our projects. So I have always been really struck by a sentence in your introduction, Adam, where you describe that experience of going to talk to Marion Smith, who many of us know, the INS historian, who was sort of the main institutional memory for obviously the history of the INS, and knows which records are public, which ones have been mysteriously lost, and which ones are not yet public. But you mentioned this encounter, and then you discussed the ways in which you had reached this early, what you thought was a roadblock. And you write in the book, how does one write a history of something designed to leave no paper trail? So you've already talked, you and Jimmy have already mentioned some of the avenues that a historian and others need to follow, the oral histories. But you also submitted FOIA requests. You went into many organizations. And so I guess my larger question is, if you were to, if you had the power, or if you were to be advising on how we might be collecting and archiving a history of the now, but especially deportation now, so that our students, the future generations who are going to be looking back at the late 20th and early 21st century, they may not have to do the kinds of excavation that you have done. What do you think we should be paying attention to in terms of collecting?
Yeah, that's a great question. And certainly the IHRC and the archive are doing really, really wonderful work. And the Immigrant Stories Project, I mean, there's so many ways in which I think it starts in the community. It shouldn't be kind of academics or institutions saying, like, this is what's important, this is what we value and what we want to know, what we kind of want to extract from the community. I think it should be collaborative efforts where institutions and scholars and journalists are collaborating with community members and bringing people into the fold in a way that is somewhat organic, where also the community members are taking the lead. And as I was mentioning, kind of academics and those in institutions of relative power, or at least with resources, are able to support that type of work. So taking the lead from the community and the people most affected would be a place to start. But also diversifying the voices, diversifying the source bases, encouraging people perhaps whose stories haven't historically been recorded to donate them, or creating and I guess investing the resources, getting the resources, investing the resources into creating those repositories. And I think there's more now than certainly before. But historically, there's still such an imbalance. And that's something that will take a lot of money and time and investment and effort to do. And the other thing I would say is that people are doing this work, which is really wonderful. So there's, in addition to the work happening there at University of Minnesota, there's things like the Humanizing Deportation Project out of UC Davis that's collecting people's stories, multimedia format in English and in Spanish, video interviews with people. The Bracero History Archive, an incredible resource. I mean, so some of this work is already happening, has been happening. It's not as if there's nothing there, but I think we could certainly agree that there should be a lot more, and that more collaborations with the community and investment from institutions would be a place to start. But I don't know, maybe you and Jimmy also have ideas.
I was going to add trust. Community trust, right? That it doesn't just happen overnight. It happens over generations, decades. I think about many of our colleagues' works, and I'm thinking about Kelly Little Hernandez's project on incarceration, and how her project, she frames it as reparative work, but also as injecting community control over the history of policing, right? In gaining access in with FOIA requests and others, but in demanding access to the sources that document the brutal treatment of Black and Brown communities in LA, for example, and how there's just there's so many good examples for all of us to follow. I don't know, Jimmy, what did you want to say?
Yeah, I echo that. But another thing I thought of, well, my class is doing a kind of archival project, just a Facebook page we have where we post what's going on in the media, or through the lens of the state, or through the lens of the community, post different things about what's going on in order to grapple with it and have an archive of what happened during this time we had this class in regards to immigration. So I'm reminded, another grad school mentor, Nayan Shaw, always noted that the state, whether intentionally or unintentionally, reveals its narrative. It reveals its, because of its bureaucratic and document-based kind of way it works. We can excavate that, but we need the critical lens to do that. So those ties to ethnic studies, to valuing, racialized communities and migrant communities that have their own knowledge, using that perspective to analyze dominant archival sources is important. I think Adam's book really demonstrates that. And then just to echo again, just it has to be tied to the community. For migrant folks, particularly those without documentation, part of their strategy is to often be hidden from the surveillance that's set up, right? I think of Nestor Rodriguez's article, Battle for the Border, where it's actually part of their agency to create transnational communities that are not always visible to the state and to other powerful entities. So for our archival project to excavate those voices, they would need to, those communities would need to lead them, right? They would need to see the usefulness in them and creating their own space and maintaining their own communities.
We've got a bunch of questions that have been gathering in the Q&A. So this is your last chance to put in a question for Adam, for Jimmy. And I'm going to start with one that mentions, as I read throughout the book, it seemed that many Mexican immigrants that you interviewed were from Jalisco. And why did this work out this way? Were people from this particular state more likely to migrate than those from other interior Mexican states?
Yeah, thank you for that question. There are a number of Mexican states that historically have sent large numbers of migrants to the United States, dating back generations. And one of them is Jalisco, Michoacán, Guanajuato, Zacatecas. Those are all others as well. And I could have really chosen any number of states, but I had a particular contact and affiliation with the University of Guadalajara there in the state of Jalisco, and through that contact, I was able to make connection with a family outside of the city, and they're incredibly generous and let me come and stay with them for a while, and I got to know their town a lot better. And they also introduced me to many of the people, both in their family and in the town, all of whom had experiences migrating or their family members had. So that proved to be a really valuable resource. And part of it was an investment of, again, the time and the resources that, from a fellowship that I had that made that possible, but also the generosity of colleagues, and it speaks to the fact that so much of the work is done in collaboration and thanks to the generosity of others. First and foremost, the family that welcomed me into their home, which they certainly didn't have to do. So I'm grateful for that. But Jalisco is historically a state that migration scholars have looked at, and there's a lot of great work there. So that was a place that I knew that I might consider.
Great. A question from Dania Barrera. They ask, as you were researching Leonel Castillo, how did you feel about him leading the INS as a Mexican-American, yet him still facing racism from his colleagues who shared their opinions on immigration?
I want to ask Jimmy the same question, actually. He's written about this as well. And I think it's a very difficult question. And Leonel Castillo, I think in a lot of respects had very good intentions and wanted to go in and change the system from within, and quickly realized the limitations of the ability to do that. And whatever reforms they might put in place under the Carter administration, whether it's, as we've seen today, a lot of the same things are happening, like changing the terminology we use, right? Referring to people as undocumented workers instead of illegal immigrants. That was something that was happening in the late 1970s, all while hundreds of thousands of people continued to be expelled. And Castillo found himself kind of getting criticisms from the administration, from kind of hardline restrictionists, also getting criticisms from Chicano activists, like the ones that Jimmy writes about in his book. So I think he found himself in a very tough spot, and I think that perhaps that's one of the reasons he didn't last more than a couple of years. But Jimmy, what would you say?
Yeah, thanks for that. My class has heard some of my stories about Leonel Castillo, and even the Chicano activists that I interviewed mentioned some remorse about how hard they kind of critiqued him. I mean, they didn't back away from the structural critique, but
right,
a lot of it was really, really personal, and it was really great to see you pick up on that and like depict the really difficult position the first Mexican-American commissioner of the INS had to deal with. And I think for the class, it really revealed the depth of racism that is embedded in that system, which I think the activists in my research, it helped them grapple with, here's a kind of reformer coming in attempting to change things, and the system is so powerful, thorough, that he ends up conforming to a lot of the militarization and this interest kind of things that are embedded in the system. So it definitely didn't make me envy his position to read your addition to thinking about Castillo. But yeah, it's just kind of reflective of liberal positions on immigration and how they try to balance opposing interests that are contradictory to one another.
Yeah, and in a way, there's some parallels. I mean, I wrote a short piece about this, but I think there's some parallels to the position that Alejandro Mayorkas finds himself in today for the Biden administration.
I'm going to combine two questions because I think they complement each other. So one is from Yamiles Ordonez, another from Chiara Padilla. First is from Chiara. You mentioned that Mexican residents had some type of understanding of the processes and outcomes of US deportation. Can you talk a little bit more about how living in Mexico influenced how you viewed US deportation of migrants as a transnational issue? And then kind of from the other side, would you consider folks, this is from Yamilas, would you consider folks who immigrate to the US to work and then leave whenever they have accumulated enough resources, self-deportation or some other thing? I know this personally happens a lot in Latin communities, especially Mexico.
Yeah, thank you both for those really excellent and important questions. About the transnational focus and then my time living in Mexico, it's funny because originally when I was conceptualizing this project, I thought it was going to be much more transnational. I thought it was going to be a story that would follow people migrating to the United States, their experience crossing the border, living in the US, being apprehended, detained, deported, returning back to Mexico, and then returning to the US again. So kind of like a cycle of migration or deportation. And what I came to realize as I got deeper into the research was this was more a story about state power, about the US exercising unilateral power through voluntary departures. Because one of the things I didn't mention at the beginning, but is really important, is that formal deportations require another state to recognize someone as their national or their citizen and to accept them back. Voluntary departures don't require that. So this was kind of the US flexing its power to expel people without having to engage in some question of international relations with Mexico. And in part, my time in the Mexican archives, maybe I was looking in the wrong places, but I don't think so. I spent a lot of time digging through Mexican archives, revealed to me that the Mexican government didn't really do nearly as much as it could or care as much as I thought they would have, perhaps, about deportees. Mexican consuls certainly cared about Mexican citizens living in the United States, and there's many people working on that, including a friend and colleague, Romeo Guzman at Claremont. And at the same time, I was surprised to find a real dearth of information. So just to take an example to make the point, the most infamous deportation campaign in US history in the 1950s, Operation Wetback, as it was called. And I use that kind of in that term in the historical context. I found very little in the Mexican archives about that campaign, right, in which the United States claimed to have deported, announced, kind of publicized they're deporting hundreds of thousands, up to 1 million people. And a lot of that was PR and puffing up the INS's own reputation. But the Mexican archives didn't really have much of that. And in fact, I found a memo for people that really kind of were into the fine grained nitty gritty and look at the footnotes of my book. I found a memo that stated the US officials sent the Mexican government a note saying, we hope to deport 25,000 people as part of this campaign. Their sights were set a lot lower, but Mexican government wasn't taking as much notice either. So it became much more story about US state power. That being said, there's so much more work that can be done and should be done really about the experiences of deportees after they return, because obviously their lives continue. And some people are already taking that up and have done excellent work there. The other question, I think, is also something that I thought so much about the terminology, about these categories and the mechanisms that I described at the beginning, and how can I get people to understand them? And it's Not as easy as I perhaps first thought, because these bureaucratic, dry, technical terms, which are purposefully misleading or euphemistic, I needed to figure out a way to explain them. So I would say the example given is that if someone comes to the United States, earns money, and then decides, you know what, I'm going to return home because I want to go home, that wouldn't qualify or I wouldn't classify that as a self-deportation. People who are self-deporting, as I understand it and as I write about it, are people who are leaving in response to a concerted effort of a government official or even sometimes ordinary citizens who are threatening people with violence. But it's only in response to those concerted efforts that I would qualify something as a self-deportation. And it's hard to track. We can't quantify them, in fact. And that's part of the point. And that's one of the challenges that we face. But we do know that they happen. And there are examples that I provide in the book of people self-deporting in response to these punitive laws or violence and threats in the media. So not everyone who leaves or returns would qualify as someone who's self-deporting. I think that those lines are important, and the differences between the mechanisms I want to emphasize are important too. And I'm not saying all expulsions are the same. There's really important differences between them, but we gain something in how the deportation machine works by having an expansive definition.
I think where one of the gray areas comes in is when there is such a widespread climate of fear and reign of terror that promotes feelings of not belonging, of fear, of brutalization, that may not be coming in a direct form from a deportation order, but just living under the shadows. I know this is the case for generations of other immigrants, not just Mexicans, and
right.
that you both write about. We have time for one last question that I'm going to combine again. And one is one that I mentioned earlier about reckoning with this history. You title the epilogue Reckoning with the Deportation Machine. And there's been a lot of discussion in our country about reckoning with our racial past, reckoning with racism. So I wanted to ask, what does, as a historian having written this book, what does reckoning with this history mean to you? And I'm going to combine that with a question from Tessa Lynch, who wants to ask about really what is possible in terms of immigration policy today. She says it's easy to think that the only way is to fix the system is to burn it down and start all over. But given the conservative nature of our country, what do you think is feasible?
All in 60 seconds.
Exactly. Take a few more minutes. Take a few more minutes.
These are such important questions. And as I thought about the book and the takeaways, as I was finishing up the epilogue and reflecting back on the century and a half of history that I cover, thinking about some of the lessons, I think, was important to recognize the continuities that I mentioned, kind of the consistent through line of the fact that the system as it was constructed and then emerged and developed over time, is one that has not served, I think, our country well. It's not served immigrants and their family members well. And it's also created the false notion that there are these harder lines than we would like to admit between us and them, so to speak. And that's really detrimental. And I think that the kind of going in a different direction, if we are to move forward in a different direction, more humane policy regime or some kind of system that works better for everyone involved, and to recognize that the shared interests in citizens and non-citizens and those in this country who can't easily be separated, regardless of what politicians and talking heads on TV might lead you to think, that would first take kind of an accounting and reckoning with kind of the past, the honest past of this history. And that's something that another book that I really admire does very well. But Erika's book, America for Americans, traces a very similar story in history that's really, I think, complementary to the one that I tell. And Erika, I think you were really helpful as I was working on my book and wrapping it up and making me think about the ending and about how to how to think constructively about the takeaways and the fact that a lot of the story I tell doesn't necessarily lead us or point us in an optimistic direction. I mean, the last line of the book says that regardless of who wins the 2020 election, the deportation machine is going to continue. It doesn't matter which party or politician is in power unless things really change. And I think they can. And this speaks to Tessa's question. And that's that I think the radical language that activists have put forth in recent years about abolish ICE or burn it all down, I think that's actually really important and productive, even if it's not realistic in the short term, because immigration policy has moved so much in kind of what is possible. The rhetoric that we hear about immigration has moved so much to the restrictionist side of things in recent years that it's important to put, I think, on the table all policies and possibilities for what our system might look like. I know it's really a non-starter for most elected officials these days in Congress. But at the same time, there might be other ways through legislative reforms, which would only happen through widespread mobilizations, I think, from the ground up and pressuring politicians to act. But there might be ways to abolish ICE through other means. And as I said, for the end of my brief presentation at the start of our time today, if we can minimize the number of people over whom immigration officials exercise control and discretionary authority, that would be a first step. So a legislative package that both legalized people in the country without authorization and provided a way for people to come to the United States in the future with authorization. They recognized both the labor needs and also the family connections that so many people have. That would effectively minimize the number of people, or perhaps even eliminate the number of people over whom ICE, say, has control over. And that would be a first starting point to then maybe wind down their budget. But as ICE puts in budget requests each year, they're asking for more and more money. The Department of Homeland Security is asking for more and more money. And if all of a sudden they don't have discretionary authority over the millions of people currently in the country without authorization, then things could change. So there might be creative solutions, but it will take kind of legislative action, and that's only going to happen through organizing that starts in the community.
And with that, what a perfect way to end as a call to action. Thank you so much, Adam. Thank you so much, Jimmy. Thank you so much, Jimmy's class, for the great questions. And thank you all who attended this afternoon. We really appreciate it. We hope you'll join us at another event at the IHRC this fall. Thank you again.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Hey, yay! I was waiting for the people to leave,